Welcome to Handi Quilter Watch and Learn. Today we're going to show you some fun eye candy. I'm Christina Whitney, a studio educator here with Handi Quilter, and
Kim Sandberg, studio educator too.
Isn't that fun?
It is.
So today we are going to talk about ourselves.
Yes.
Just kidding. But we're mostly going to talk about our field educators.
Yes.
So Handi Quilter, we have about 40 educators that travel around the whole world actually.
Yep.
And they teach events and they work at the shows and they participate in quilt challenges with us. So for 2023, the theme for the quilt challenge was black and white quilts. Now, this was kind of going to go along with our academy theme of Cinema Academy, movies and stuff. So my mind, I automatically thought it was black, white, and red.
Yeah.
Like, that's all that my brain thought. But then the quilts started coming in.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Everybody was so creative.
Yes.
Came up with these fun little pops of color to go in their quilt. So Kim, tell us what the actual challenge was, like the amounts that they could and couldn't use and things like that.
Okay. So the educators were given parameters for the size. So they couldn't do a super huge quilt. I think it was like 60 by 60 at the biggest. The smallest was like 24 inches square. And they had to use black and white, and they could use shades of white and shades of black plus one color. And the one color couldn't be more than 25% of the quilt. And we made a caveat on that as they started getting into it. They could use more than one color of thread. So you'll see some of the quilts that have a few other colors in them besides just black and white and one color, but it's the thread. It's the thread that made it that way.
Yeah, and
so,
the people that use the thread as their pop of color, you'll see those in a moment. It's just fantastic job.
Really incredible. It's I love doing these challenges because we all start with essentially exactly the same thing, and what we end up with is so varied. And the educators all used fabric from their own stash. We just want to let everybody know that up front. And a lot of these are original creations, which is even more awesome.
Meaning we are not sharing any patterns.
No, sorry, we don't know. We're going to read the artist statement that they send in that goes with each quilt. If there is a pattern maker to credit, it will be credited there. Otherwise, it's our creative educators that came up with these fantastic quilts.
Yep. So let's jump into it.
Yeah, let's
start with our first quilt.
Harriet Carpanini, Madison, Indiana. This is called Libby's Log Cabin. I love traditional quilts with a twist. I saw this pattern, Libby's Log Cabin, in a Fawns and Porter magazine, and I knew I wanted to add it to my collection. Having no idea what colorway I would choose, I opened the closet to my stash and my black and whites caught my eye. Looking for a pop of color, I found a piece of red that was perfect for this project. Being a long-arm quilter, I often like to put a twist on the quilting. I found a block pattern called Christoph's Dream by One Song Needle Arts. When I put two identical blocks side by side, it created a wonderful secondary pattern that showcased well in the background fabric. I'm excited to add this quilt to my collection. It will hang on my studio wall. Mara Novak of Heartland, Vermont, A Little Spice. Nicholas Turkin of Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. This is titled Gray Matters. Kay Collins of Lehi, Utah, Scan Me. Our world has changed in so many ways over the past few years. Most of us carry phones with cameras everywhere we go. We now recognize these designs made up of black and white squares as a QR code or quick response code. Although they were invented in 1984, they became ubiquitous during the pandemic as a way to communicate information without touch. Menus, maps, and catalogs disappeared while people used QR codes to access information from sites on the web or in the cloud. A quilt, which usually brings comfort through touch, now functions in the touchless world of the QR code and takes you to a site that holds information about its inception and creation. The nearly invisible thread that holds the layers together and instructs the viewer to scan me represents the web cloud that we use daily, but few of us see or understand. You can scan this code and go to Kay's blog post, which has information about all of the quilts in this collection. Cheryl Lane of Burlington, Ontario, Canada. Follow your creative compass. When given the black and white challenge quilt, I thought black and white with a hint of color was a nice option, but black isn't a color I use very often. So to make the fabric choice easy, I decided to work with Northcott solids, which are available at my local quilt shop. I chose yellow to add a splash of sunshine to the rainy day palette. In EQ8, I came up with a design using compass blocks for parts of the design. I've had the Skinny Robin ruler by Robin Ruth Designs for quite a while, and this was an opportunity to have fun. It was quilted on my Handi Quilter Amara with Pro Stitcher designs, rulers, and a bit of free motion. It has 2 layers of batting. The whole story I could have named the quilt my mini first, but I followed the creativity process to get the compasses done, hence follow your creative compass. When given the challenge, I thought black and white was simple. Looking back as I made each design choice, I also made the quilt more challenging. It's hard to hide any errors in solids when quilting, but it turned out great, so it was definitely worth pushing my creativity, which is why I named it Follow Your Creative Compass. When using a new ruler, it's always good to make a few test blocks. Using the Skinny Robin ruler to strip piece the pie segments, trimming them and assembling to create the compass circles was fun. I will be doing other projects. They can be applique or reverse applique on the background block. So I chose reverse applique because it gave a nice clean circle edge. Another new technique to add to a challenge for me, and it turned out great with the help of lots of pins. Once the piecing was done, then it sat on the design wall as I looked and tried to envision a secondary pattern in the quilting, but it didn't happen. I got out the preview paper and tried some options and still couldn't decide. Finally, I just loaded the quilt on my Amara and using 2 layers of batting, because why not, basted the layers of the whole quilt and did some stitch in the ditch. I found a few designs in Pro Stitcher and started stitching. Wow, the 2 layers of batting made it look fabulous. To echo the compass block, I used mark because why not try something new to me? Some of them turned out better than others, but I learned a lot and it still looks great. Finally, I got to the border. This is usually where I would normally free motion, but another first was using a Pro Stitcher design and then turning the quilt. Note to self, make sure the backing edges are straight before reattaching the quilt, otherwise the quilt doesn't sit square. So here's the list of first. First project using Skinny Robin ruler, first reverse applique quilt, first time using double batting, and it won't be the last. First quilt I've designed and finished using EQ8, first time using the mark feature in Pro Stitcher borders and turning the quilt for the first time, and my first HQ Educator Challenge. I think this created a challenging quilt, and I learned so many things, and I'm proud to say it's done and labeled. Karen Arnold of Johnstown, Ohio. With the black and white theme for Academy 2023, I felt like it needed a more modern flair than I am used to. My cousin, Debbie Yule, came up with the design, and I felt that each window was an opportunity to showcase my free motion, ruler work, and Pro Stitcher skills. Over the years, I am learning the importance of giving my eyes a place to rest, so I intentionally left the narrow sashings unquilted so the focus would be on the squares. Annette Look of Stockton, Kansas. Elegant Churn Dash. Elegant Churn Dash came to be with a challenge to all Handi Quilter educators to make a black and white quilt with a splash of color. I started looking for inspiration to address this challenge and came across an article of traditional quilts being transformed into more modern settings. Since the Churn Dash is recognized as a very traditional block, I felt adding heavy, elegant quilting would add a unique look to the challenge. The color palette, black and white, was chosen for us, but the pop of turquoise was my own choice. It was a color that I thought would bring a bit of surprise in the comparison to the way the Churn Dash is usually presented. To keep the tradition of the pattern, I used the turquoise to draw the eye to the center of each of the blocks, adding more interest. Heavy flowing quilting was used to bring the blocks forward. Quiltable was my go-to for most of the quilting designs using my Handi Quilter Pro Stitcher. I found the patterns worked well together, showcasing each block. Lee Zip of Brielle, New Jersey. Shadow. Well, this turned out to be more challenging than I originally thought. How hard can a bunch of rectangles be? I had always wanted to make a Pac-Man quilt as it reminded me of summer days at the shore in the arcade with my friends. When Pac-Man came out, we would hop on our bikes and meet at the arcade and compete for the highest scores till our quarters ran out. What fun. Anyway, I spent some hours with a graph pad drawing all the lines in order to stay within the size constraints. I cut out a portion of the quilt to test my sizing and found that the vertical rows were not proportional. I scrapped the quilt, annoyed with myself. I started on a different pattern from an old magazine that I resized to fit a 40 by 40 inch square and hated it. It is sitting in my unfinished pile. After a lot of going back and forth, I realized the Pac-Man quilt only needed a slight size adjustment to work out. So back to the graph paper. Testing out the circles, I chose to crop and not applique. Cropping is very persnickety, and just when you got it down pat, it changes up on you. I am a pro at cropping now. The circles had to be placed individually in order to line up within the maze. I used white stickers along the rows so I could line up my crops. The ghosts and Pac-Man were made in Designer. I left the white maze parts unquilted for a 3D look. Looking at the maze now, it could use some quilting. The fabric was Connecting Threads Nuances Denor, Superior Thread So Fine, and batting is wool and cotton. I had a blast working on this quilt. Black and white fabric really shows your piecing, which I wish I could go back and fix. Oh well, I'll do it on the next one. D. Meyer Adams of Bedford, Texas. Murder Mystery at the Cinema. I love murder mysteries as movies, television shows, or books. So when the National Educators were challenged to make a quilt for the 2023 Handi Quilter Academy, whose theme was to be Cinema Academy, I immediately thought of the whodunits I so enjoy. We were told we could only use black and gray and white, but could include a small amount of a third color, so of course I had to put some blood in the quilt. This is an original design quilted with So Fine by Superior Threads and solid fabrics by Connecting Threads. Wayna Kirshner of Northeast Pennsylvania. Showtime! The Handi Quilter National Educator Challenge this year was to make a black and white quilt with a pop of color. Showtime in black and white was pieced and ready to be quilted. It just needed a pop of color. The layout is arranged using Drunkard's Path quilt blocks. The Cinema Academy theme for the 2023 Handi Quilter Academy was just the ticket to get it quilted. Add the pop of color and give it a name. Edie Waite of Jamestown, North Dakota. BU. Here is the story of how my BU quilt was born. When I decided to participate in Handi Quilter's Black and White Quilt Challenge, I searched the internet for inspiration. I spent hours and days looking and just couldn't find anything that spoke to me. As it turns out, I didn't have to search the internet. I just had to look at what was right in front of me. I retired in 2021 and spent most of the summer on my deck when I was not quilting for my customers. I armed myself with iced tea and YouTube to see if I could draw a face. No one in particular, just a face. As my drawing journey progressed, I broke out the watercolors. I just couldn't live with blacks and white. All the abstract faces I had drawn just had to have color. When I decided to join in on the Black and White Challenge, I took one of my drawings and made it into an applique. I digitized the name of the quilt and then quilted it in the background using metallic thread from Superior Threads. I then Zentangled, free motion quilted, the background and each section of her hair. I also used couching to define each section of the hair, all on my Amara 20. The Black and White Challenge has been an interesting journey for me as I usually use many colors, prints, and textures in my quilts. The more the merrier. Edie Waite of Jamestown, North Dakota, Frequency Quilt. I knew I would make more than one quilt once I decided to participate in the Black and White Challenge. When I spied the frequency pattern by Desert Bloom at Designer Fabrics in Carrington, North Dakota, I knew this would be my next quilt. I fell in love with the movement in the pattern and knew it would be perfect for showcasing an edge-to-edge design I digitized using Designer. I love the way my digitized design mimics the movement of the pattern. I pulled things from my stash. I have plenty of black and whites, as I'm usually all about the color. The Black and White Challenge has been an interesting journey for me. I normally use as many colors, prints, and textures as possible in my quilts. The more the merrier. This quilt was quite the challenge for me as I had not yet attempted half rectangle triangles. All those bias edges and points to match. I didn't let all the edges or points defer me. I just jumped in and went to work. I'm quite pleased with the outcome. I hope this quilt brings you joy and inspires you to just jump in and go to work. I take a chance and try something new. Who knows, you may surprise yourself. Happy quilting! Karen Woolley of St. James, New York, Thread in Motion. The inspiration for the Black and White Challenge quilt came from the challenge's theme, motion picture. Motion is represented in several ways throughout this piece. I portrayed motion through fabric choice, piecing, and quilting design. I was drawn to the Drunkard's Path quilt pattern because of the way the curves in the pattern depict movement. I was inspired by my choice of fabric for similar reasons. The black fabric depicts motion through its motifs of needle, thread, and stitching pattern. The white fabric with its circle motifs is arranged in an offset column of half circles that draws the viewer's eye down an uneven path. The green highlight fabric and thread are bright and help to move the viewer's eye around the quilt. I use the feathery quilting design throughout the quilt because it represents movement in several ways. I hope that the viewer has fun exploring the different patterns and techniques I used to create a sense of motion throughout this quilt. Mary Yoder of Anaheim, California. I love Handi Quilter. When asked to do this challenge quilt, I wanted to try and create some film rolls, so that is why I chose the open Dresden plates. When I created a quilt, I like to use numerous tools. I used Pro Stitcher for some of the designs, I used Free Motion for some of the designs, and also rulers for creating my straight lines. I could not find designs that I wanted to use, so I also created some of my own designs using Designer. I have such a strong love for Handi Quilter, so that is why I quilted that on my quilt. Patty Sliney of San Diego, California. San Diego Beauty. When we were presented with this quilt challenge, I knew immediately what type of quilt I wanted to make for the challenge. I've always had a New York Beauty quilt on my bucket list, so I was excited to check it off the list. I looked at lots of New York Beauty quilt patterns and finally settled on a pattern by Kelly Biskopnik and Andrea Johnson. The quilt pattern is Midtown Girl, and it is included in their book entitled Modern Designs for Classic Quilts. I love their version of this New York Beauty style quilt, as it is truly a modern twist on a very classic quilt design. Since I live in the greater San Diego, California area, I've named my version of the quilt San Diego Beauty. In keeping with the black and white color palette requirement for this challenge, I selected a fabric collection from Connecting Threads called Nuances de Noir, which also is designed with a modern twist on a very classic reproduction design theme. I opted for just a tiny pop of red to add a touch of interest, so I used the Liberty of London Tana lawn fabric I had in my stash. I used a piping binding technique to carry through the tiny red accent. I used ruler work and computerized quilting. I opted to double back my quilt using Quilter's Dream 80/20 and a layer of Quilter's Dream wool on top for more definition and texture. All the threads used were from Superior Threads. I also used Superior Sewfine 50 weight on top and Superior bottom line in the bottom. And my quilt was quilted on my trusty Handi Quilter Fusion with Pro Stitcher Premium. Jen Eskridge of San Antonio, Texas. Ideal Workflow. The arrangement of this modern quilt is 100% inspired by Nancy Purvis Studio. Her inspiration art piece was used with permission from the artist. The art is digitized and quilted on layered faux suede and cotton. The faux suede is then cut away to reveal the perfect-ish white rings, much like a planned workday with a couple bright blue suede treats. Also, much like a workday, there's a few rings of irregular, free motion quilted aqua details to keep the entire piece interesting and unexpected. The background digital quilting design is by PS Patterns. Lana Russell of Vancouver, Oregon. Pumpkin Patch. My favorite season is autumn, and I love this pattern. It has been on my to-do list for a few years. Motivation came in the form of a challenge. The Handi Quilter Educator Challenge is to make a black and white quilt plus one other color, not more than 25% of the quilt. Time is always a factor, and this quilt, being only 36 by 36 inches, was doable considering my teaching and traveling schedule between now and the due date. Easy decision. Finally got to make this quilt. When I decided how to quilt it, I knew I wanted to make ghost pumpkins on some of the background squares to mimic the orange pumpkins, so I played around with the idea for the background. How to make it look like a pumpkin patch, pumpkin leaves with a wisp of curls, small pebbles and swirls. The latter would make the ghost pumpkin stand out, so that was the decision. Challenge accepted and completed on time. Christina Whitney of Farmington, Utah. Wedding quilt to baby quilt? I used the leftover pieces from my daughter's wedding quilt, but I was short one block. Enter the Papa Red. Hopefully this quilt will wrap around a grandbaby soon. Barb Tatera of Scottsdale, Arizona. In the Still of the Night. When I heard about the black and white challenge, I immediately thought about doing some form of a silhouette. I also wanted to try something outside of the box, so I decided on a black whole cloth rather than piecing traditional blocks. The flowers were cut from wedding lace and appliqued onto the black background. I left myself plenty of negative space, which I filled with the butterflies and feathers. As my Papa color, I used Magnifico, a shiny tri-lobal polyester, to fill the butterflies. Cynthia Gill of Gaithersburg, Maryland. The Handi Quilter National Educator Challenge this year was to make a black and white quilt with less than 25% of color. I selected the pattern Echo Star from Diamond Star Quilts by Barbara Klein. I quilted it on my Handi Quilter Forte using a sampling of Pro Stitcher quilting designs. Megan Best of Ferndale, Washington. Mod. The pop of lime green against black and white makes this a fun, fabulous quilt. Kim Sandberg of Kaysville, Utah. Kinetic Motion. This improv quilt was pieced during a long weekend in June 2022 with a friend in Park City, Utah. I started with a couple of previously pieced New York beauty blocks from the book New York Beauties and Flying Geese by Carl Hensch. Next, I pulled black and white scraps from my scrap bag and just made the pieces fit, cutting and filling the space. I really enjoy working in the improvisational style, just seeing what happens with the fabric I'm using. Once the top was pieced, the quilt top sat for almost 8 months, basted and ready to be quilted. I finally found the creativity and time to tackle the quilting towards the end of January 2023. The quilting is a mix of basic pro stitcher designs, rulers, and micro quilting. The quilting designs combine to create movement throughout the quilt, complementing the motion in the wheels of black and white. My daughter Maya named the quilt inspired by classes in physical science on the laws of motion. Allison Spence, Calgary, Alberta, Canada. I saw stars. I approach each new project with a what else can I do attitude. I learn the rules, and once I know what the rules are, I can then do my best to bend, stretch, or break the rules in a creative way. I try to take this into my quilting projects and teaching opportunities. Every project I work on or teach is a learning opportunity for me and my students. I like to give my students a strong foundation so that they too can stretch, bend, and break the rules and create on their own with confidence. This started as a painful challenge as I broke my arm this summer dyeing the green fabric. I tripped, hit my shoulder against the side of my house, and saw stars. Getting my arm working for the piecing and then the quilting with my Amara and a selection of the ring rulers was an extra challenge. I found the Smooth Jazz pattern from Studio 180 Design and decided to use this new to me block for the stars. The blocks needed extra fabric to put them on point. I loved quilting these small mandalas and trying a wide variety of ways to show off the quilting with the contrast thread. Chris Souza of Goodyear, Arizona. Squared circles. Not being a modern quilter by training, this quilt took me out of my comfort zone. It is 48 by 48 inches, and the inspiration came from Linda Warren of Linda Warren Designs, the inventor of the Learn Curve ruler. The challenge was blacks and whites with an optional color. I tried to use the gradients of fabric to create a faux 3D look as your perspective changes and you step back or get closer. The quilting was done on my Infinity with Pro Stitcher and using Designer to help with the digitizing of the patterns. Lori Brothers of Santa Clarita, California. Fly Away With Me. I have always loved the look of curve piecing, but never loved the process of it. While looking for something unique to make for this challenge, I was browsing YouTube videos on the illusion of curves by way of the traditional straight cuts, when I happened upon the curved log cabin technique. By simply changing the strip size of the secondary log, we create the illusion of curves. I've always loved black and white quilts and knew that this technique would help me to achieve something creative and unique with these opposites. I used a black and white fat quarter bundle with silver metallics by Michael Miller, which had been in my stash for quite some time, just waiting for the right project. Quilting techniques include free motion and rulers. Stitch in the ditch and dense quilting in the black areas gave the feathers and curves in the white bird areas more loft, making them stand out even more. Ashley Reuter of Bountiful, Utah. Thank you. Next, number 24. I began working on this project during the filming of Handi Quilter's Clueless Quilter, episode 5. I decided to approach it as a sampler quilt that would feature different stitching techniques. My friend, Kim Sandberg, taught me several tips on how to use rulers, adjust tension for various types of threads, and helped me try out special accessory feet while we filmed the episode. I also learned how to digitize quilting patterns using Designer, which I based on the flower print for my blocks. I worked on this quilt from December 2021 to February 2023, so the skills I practiced on this quilt helped me create several of my other quilts during that time, and I am no longer the clueless quilter as a result. Martha Higdon of Fairland, Indiana, black and white +1. I had a box of black and white scraps, so I used the pieced blocks and added black background fabric for the background. I normally would have chosen white, but I wanted a more dramatic effect. I chose white Omni 40 weight thread, which has a definition yet shows all imperfections. I quilted it using free motion and rulers, 1 layer of Dream Poly batting. This quilt was all about the quilting and use of negative space. Diane Henry of Fairfax, Virginia, A Night at the Opera. This quilt is inspired by the Lob-Meyer crystal chandelier in the Opera House at the Kennedy Center. My husband and I have been attending the operas there and appreciating the chandelier for over 30 years. I've been wanting to use the inspiration for a quilt for years. Iris Noitele, Palm Coast, Florida, the big reel. The challenge was to make a black and white quilt with a pop of color. My pop of color is the bright teal, which adds so much to the overall look of the quilt. So the big reel came about one lazy afternoon. I was working on my original challenge, and before I knew it, it was done. Although I did like the pattern, there wasn't enough negative space for me to play, meaning free motion quilt. Since I had bought too much of the fabrics for the original quilt, I decided to use the leftovers for the second quilt. And if you know me, I love to make my own patterns, and the big reel is one of my originals. I used the leftover diamond strips, laid them out on the floor, and created a new pattern. It was quilted 90% free motion, my most favorite way to quilt, and 10% Pro Stitcher. The large white setting triangles were quilted with designs from Pro Stitcher. Enjoy all the different shapes that were filled with interesting free motion, happy quilting, from my studio to yours. Christy Helton of Lehi, Utah. P.S. Light Zen Doodle. I knew I wanted to do something that would showcase Pro Stitcher Light and the Moxie. I spent some time looking for ideas for my black and white quilt. The Zen Doodle drawings kept catching my eye, and I decided to translate that to a quilt. I had fun adding quilting designs to a simple quilt and giving it just a touch of color. Denise Dowdrick of Woods Cross, Utah. Black and white snowball. This is my black and white snowball quilt, inspired by the AccuQuilt snowball die. I made 6 12-inch blocks to make a table topper. I used fat quarters from a Connecting Threads fabric collection. This was free motion quilted on the Mara ST for a couple of HQ Live episodes. Audrey by Denise Dowdrick of Woods Cross, Utah. Inspired by a photo of Audrey Hepburn as Holly Golightly from the film Breakfast at Tiffany's. The techniques: I used reverse applique and free motion quilting with 3 fabrics from my stash and 3 threads, monopoly, metallic silver, and glitter from Superior, to make this fun quilt really pop.
So those were some exciting quilts.
Oh, they're so amazing. I forgot how great they were. As you were holding each one of those up, I'm like, oh, I remember when they would come in, they meld all of them in, the excitement of opening the package and seeing what they did. I'm so inspired. I think I'm ready to go make some more quilts. What about you?
I love it, and I especially love the smaller size, because you know I tend to do king size of everything, and it gets a little overwhelming. But these smaller projects, they're so much fun. So can we tell the viewers where they can see these quilts?
Yeah, definitely. So we usually partner with OSQE. Those are some awesome national shows that happen pretty much, I think, all over the U.S. So in 2024, they are planning on having this collection there. So be sure to stop by any of the OSQE shows and check them out. This entire collection will be there of, I think it's like right around 30 quilts. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah. Hopefully you'll have fun with that. But thank you for joining us today as we shared our black and white challenge. And make sure you like and subscribe and leave comments, and have fun quilting.